Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to see you here, and sorry about last week that we didn't get to meet. But we're picking up with chapter 6, the last chapter of Ephesians. We have tonight, and we have 3 more sessions, and then we're finished with the book of Ephesians. It actually, I called it a stroll through Ephesians, and it actually ended up taking a little more focus than I expected, but it's been enjoyable and good and beneficial for me. So if you remember, last time we were together, we looked at Ephesians chapter 5, and it talked about husbands and wives. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. I'm not going to revisit that, but I want to remind you that first part, wives, submit to your husbands, was a given. That was culturally understood by Greeks, Romans, Jews, the ancient world. That other part, the second part, husbands, love your wives. Give yourself up for her. Love her like Christ loved the church. That's new stuff. That Paul was saying something there that was distinctly Christian, distinctly Christ-based, and it elevated the wife to a place that the wife had not been elevated before. It's unfortunate that women, by and large, lost that elevation over the decades and centuries and years, and all of us have known religious, quote-unquote, Christian situations where men, in the name of Christ, were jerks and were abusive and were not at all like Christ. But what Paul calls for is for men to treat their wives like Jesus loved the church. And that was new onto the scene. So now, in chapter 6, we're going to deal with 2 more relationship subjects. One tonight, one next week. Families, parents, and children. And then next week, however word you want to use, slaves or servants and masters. We'll talk about that next week. But again, Paul is he's already talked about husbands and wives. Now he's going to talk about children, parents, and then next week we'll see him talking about outside the family in the broader social structure of the Roman Empire, slaves and masters. So, this is going to be a short lesson tonight, I think, but there are a couple things I want to point out to you that I want you to just ponder from the text. So I'll start with verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because this is right. The word children here, teknon, is a general word. There are, just like in English, in Greek, there are words for infant, toddler, teenager, adolescent, son, daughter, but there's this generic word for kids, children. That's the word Paul uses here. He's speaking to children. So it could be 5-year-olds, it could be 15-year-olds, it could be anything in between. It could be daughters, could be sons, without regard to sex or age, children in general. Just like our English word, children. There are 2 things I want you to consider before we actually jump into what Paul says. The first is that Paul is writing to a group of churches. It says Ephesians, we talked in the first class about how it's really a circular letter that goes to several different congregations. And it's to be read in public in church. Oh, we got a letter from the Apostle Paul. We're going to read it Sunday morning. In fact, we're going to take the next 6 Sundays and we're going to read a little bit at a time. That's how the early church worked. There were no copying machines. There were no printing presses. There was not everybody have a copy. A congregation got a copy and they read it to the congregation. So Paul wrote this expecting it to be read in church. You with me so far? And yet he addresses children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because this is right. So, here's what we can glean from that. Paul is expecting children to be in church, and he's expecting them to listen and to be teachable and to learn, and he's calling them in the Lord. Let me just quote to you from Lang and J.P. Schaff, a couple of commentators. The address to children in a letter to the church presupposes that the apostle regards them as belonging to the church, present in public worship, understanding the word read to and applicable to them. Indeed, they must be regarded as baptized. People say over and over, well, you can't find infant baptism in the Bible. Well, you're right. You can't find a verse that says, hey, baptize your babies. And I'm not going to go down a trail and talk about infant baptism right now, although I could and I would enjoy doing that. But kind of in the backdrop, there's all kinds of evidence in the scripture of children belonging to the family of God, being brought into covenant with the family of God, and consequently infant baptism. Paul understood kids to be part of the family of God, part of the body of Christ, in covenant with the Lord, belonging to the Lord. I've talked to people as a pastor over the decades. I've talked to people saying, well, we're not going to baptize our child. We're going to let them decide for themselves when they're old enough whether they want to be baptized or not. Well, that's super. Are you going to let them decide whether they want to be American citizens or not, or they just are? Are you going to make any decisions for them? Are you going to decide whether they go to school or not, or are you going to let them decide their own education? Or are you going to say, you know what, you're 6 years old and get your rear end up and you're going to school today? Parents have a responsibility to raise their children, and in the Christian world, that includes baptism and bringing them up in the faith. So that's just something alongside the text I wanted to point out. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Obey your parents. Obey, you remember the word submit? Last week we were talking about wives, submit one to another. Obey is a stronger word than submit. Submit is a voluntary decision that you make. Obey, this is a command, do what your parents say. But here's the thing I want to point out. Every Roman, every Greek, every Jew would have completely understood this. What Paul is saying in that first verse is just universally understood. Kids, obey your parents. Now he pulls in the Old Testament, so he makes it religious all of a sudden. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. Put God first. You remember the 10 Commandments? Don't bow down to idols. Don't misuse the Lord's name. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Number 5, if you remember the kids' teaching, treat your mom and dad like kings and queens. Honor your father and your mother, that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you, speaking to the whole people of Israel. Paul quotes that. He's quoting Exodus chapter 20, and he's saying, this is not just a generic teaching. This is not just what the Romans and the Greeks and everybody understood. I'm talking about what the scriptures say. I'm quoting Moses here. Honor your father and mother. And by the way, the word honor, it's more than to obey. You remember how we talked earlier last week about how submission was an attitude of the heart? Honor is an attitude of the heart. Obey your parents. Well, that's well and good. But Paul says honor them. And the word here, tima in Greek, the word here, it has the idea of love and esteem and respect. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. That's all he has to say to children. He has one more thing to say that we're going to look at tonight. Watch what he does. Do you remember when he's talking in the previous chapter, when he's writing in the previous chapter, and he starts off by saying, wives, submit to your husbands. And if there were some grumpy husband sitting in the church in Ephesus hearing that, yeah, honey, you better listen to him. And then remember, he turns the table. He goes, wait, but really what I'm talking about is husbands, love your wives. He does the same thing again here. Children, obey your parents. Honor your father and your mother. Parents, old grumpy dads, yep, you listen to him, son. And then he flips the table again. Fathers. And what I'm about to read to you is not part of Greek culture. It's not part of Roman culture. It's not even part of Jewish culture. This is the Christian, Christ-like addition that Paul throws in. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. In the parallel book, Colossians chapter 3, verse 21, fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. I love my dad with all my heart. He's the best dad ever. He gets better the older he gets. I remember days, though, when I was a kid, when he had that temper, and he would yell out things, and he would say things, and he would discourage me as a kid. Let's put it that way. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children. How many times have you experienced, or how many times have you known others to experience such frustration because of a father being mean-spirited or obstinate or full of anger or whatever, and it stirred up anger in you. It stirred up wrath in you. It stirred up discouragement in you. So he gives them a negative and a positive. Don't stir up anger in your children. King James, do not provoke your children to wrath. Another commentary I'll read you. It is the hasty, rough, moody treatment of children, so that without childish confidence, without joyful obedience, they are repelled and enticed to opposition, defiance, and bitterness. What is forbidden is painful, arbitrary, grumbling treatment, as well as rough, unjust treatment without sparing the childish nature. One more. The apostle seems to allude to provoking by vexatious commands and unreasonable blame and uncertain temper in ordinary dealings. So all of a sudden, Paul is no longer talking about how children ought to behave, but he's saying, wait a minute, there's a bigger responsibility here, particularly to you fathers. He doesn't mention mothers here. He says, honor your father and your mother, but he hones in on the dad, and he basically says, to put it in Texas vernacular, don't be a jackass. Treat your kids like Jesus would. In fact, so the negative, don't provoke them to wrath. The positive, and where we're ending tonight, but bring them up, raise them in two things, in the training and instruction of the Lord. Teach them about Jesus and teach them to be like Jesus. By word and by example. The Greek words here for training and instruction bring them up in the training and instruction. The Greek words for training and instruction imply this. Train them, show them. Show them how Jesus lived. You want your kids to be like Jesus? Show them how Jesus lived. And instruction, teach them. So, teach them about Jesus and teach them to be like Jesus. And isn't that really good instruction for all of us in all of our relationships? It's good for husbands and wives. It's good for parents and children. And we're going to see next week, it's even good for servants and masters. There you go. Thank you. Questions, comments?